Millionaire CEO never knew he had a daughter until she called him dad in a five-star restaurant. What happened next will shock you. Nicholas Carter surveyed the elegant dining room of Le Ciel, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. The soft amber lighting cast a warm glow over the pristine white tablecloths and sparkling crystal. Around him, the discreet murmur of New York's elite created the perfect backdrop for what would be the most important business dinner of his career. Tonight was the culmination of 18 months of meticulous planning. The Peterson deal, a billion-dollar acquisition that would cement Nicholas's reputation as the most formidable CEO on Wall Street. Across from him sat James Peterson himself, a notoriously difficult man to impress, alongside three members of his executive team. "To new beginnings," Nicholas said, raising his glass of 30-year-old Macallan. The amber liquid caught the light as he tilted his glass slightly. Everything about this moment had been orchestrated to perfection, down to the exact temperature of the whiskey in his hand. At 38, Nicholas Carter had built an empire from nothing. His sharp features and perpetually serious expression reflected the discipline that had taken him from a shabby apartment in Queens to the penthouse of one of Manhattan's most prestigious buildings. His tailored Tom Ford suit fit his athletic frame impeccably. Not a thread out of place, not a detail overlooked. James Peterson nodded approvingly. "I must admit, Carter, when my board suggested this meeting, I had my doubts. But your proposal—" He glanced down at the documents beside his plate. "Well, it's thorough, very thorough." Nicholas allowed himself the slightest smile. Calculated, measured, like everything else in his life. "Thoroughness is non-negotiable in my world, Mr. Peterson." The conversation flowed exactly as Nicholas had anticipated. Questions were asked and answered with precision. Numbers were discussed. Hands were shaken across the table. Within 45 minutes, Peterson was signing the preliminary agreement. Everything was proceeding with the mechanical precision that Nicholas demanded from his life. Then it happened. "Daddy?" The word hung in the air like a misplaced note in a symphony. Small, clear, and completely unexpected. Nicholas froze, the whiskey halfway to his lips. For a moment, he thought he'd imagined it, but the curious expressions on the faces across from him confirmed otherwise. "Daddy, is that you?" Nicholas turned slowly toward the voice. A little girl stood near his table, perhaps 7 or 8 years old. She wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days, white socks that didn't quite match, and scuffed shoes that spoke of a life very different from the one surrounding her in this restaurant. Her brown hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, wisps escaping around her face. But it was her eyes that stopped Nicholas cold. Gray eyes, the exact unusual shade of stormy gray that looked back at him from his own mirror every morning. "I believe there's been some mistake," Nicholas said, his voice measured despite the confusion coursing through him. He turned back to the table. "Gentlemen, if you'll excuse—" "No mistake," the girl said, her voice surprisingly steady. She stepped closer, clutching a worn photograph in one small hand. "You're Nicholas Carter. I've been looking for you." Peterson raised an eyebrow, amusement playing at the corners of his mouth. "Something you forgot to mention in your dossier, Carter." "This is absurd," Nicholas said, his legendary composure beginning to crack. He gestured discreetly to the maitre d's who hurried over. "There's been a misunderstanding. Please escort this child wherever she belongs." The girl didn't budge. Instead, she held up the photograph. "Mom gave me this before she—" Her voice caught slightly. "She said I should find you if anything happened to her." Despite himself, Nicholas looked at the picture. It showed a younger version of himself, perhaps 10 years ago, with his arm around a woman with a bright smile and honey blonde hair. Caroline, a name he hadn't allowed himself to think about in years. "Who are you?" Nicholas asked, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "I'm Ava," the girl said simply. "Your daughter." The restaurant seemed to fall silent around them, though Nicholas knew that was impossible. The world didn't stop turning just because his had suddenly tilted on its axis. "I don't have a daughter," he said firmly, though doubt had begun to creep in like an unwelcome guest. Ava didn't flinch at his denial. Instead, she studied him with those familiar gray eyes. "Mom said you'd say that. She said you never knew about me." She glanced around at the elegant restaurant, at the powerful men watching this exchange with increasing interest. I didn't want to come here like this, but I didn't know where else to go. Nicholas felt a bead of sweat form at his temple, an alien sensation for a man who prided himself on never losing control. This is hardly the time or place for this discussion. The maitre d' hovered uncertainly nearby. Sir, shall I? Mom died 3 days ago, Ava said, her voice cracking slightly. The social worker said they're sending me to foster care tomorrow. I found your picture and this address in Mom's things. She held up a business card with the restaurant's name scribbled on the back. She always kept track of where you went. Nicholas felt his chest tighten. Caroline was dead? The information hit him with unexpected force. They had parted ways years ago, before his rise to success. She had disappeared so suddenly, leaving only a brief note about needing her own path. He had been angry, then determined to forget her. He never imagined. Peterson cleared his throat. Perhaps we should continue this meeting another time, Carter. No, Nicholas said sharply, then modulated his tone. That won't be necessary, Mr. Peterson. This is clearly some kind of misunderstanding, or scam. He looked pointedly at Ava. Who put you up to this? Nobody, Ava said. She reached into the small backpack slung over her shoulder and pulled out an envelope. Mom left this for you. Before Nicholas could stop himself, he took the envelope. Caroline's handwriting was unmistakable, flowing and artistic, just as he remembered. I'll give you a moment, Peterson said, rising from his chair. His colleagues followed suit. We'll be in touch tomorrow to finalize the details. Nicholas barely registered their departure. He stared at the envelope in his hand, then at the girl who claimed to be his daughter. If this is some kind of extortion attempt, he began. I don't know what that means, Ava interrupted. But I'm not lying. Her lower lip trembled slightly, but she kept her chin up. I can prove it. I have my birth certificate. It has your name on it. Nicholas felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Uncertainty. He prided himself on always being in control, always 10 steps ahead. But here, now, he was completely unprepared. Where are you staying tonight? He asked finally. At the social worker's office, Ava answered. Until tomorrow. The restaurant continued its elegant hum around them, oblivious to the life-altering moment unfolding at table 7. Nicholas looked at his watch, a habit when he needed to ground himself. 9:30. The most important business deal of his career had just walked out the door, and here he was, faced with a crisis he never could have anticipated. Sir? A waiter appeared with the check. Will there be anything else this evening? Nicholas signed the bill without looking at it. Then he made a decision that surprised even himself. One night, he said to Ava. You can stay with me for one night while we sort this out. Relief washed over Ava's face, making her look even younger. Thank you, she whispered. Nicholas pulled out his phone and dialed his assistant. Jennifer, I need you to contact the social services department. There's a... He glanced at Ava. Situation that needs to be addressed, and reschedule tomorrow's meetings. All of them. He ended the call and stood, buttoning his jacket with practiced precision. We should go. He hesitated, then awkwardly held out his hand to Ava. She looked at it for a moment, then slipped her small hand into his. Nicholas felt an odd sensation at the contact, as if something that had been misaligned in the universe had suddenly clicked into place. The maitre d' held the door as they left, his expression professionally neutral despite the unusual scene he had witnessed. Outside, Nicholas's driver was already waiting with the car door open. Where to, Mr. Carter? The driver asked, his eyes flickering curiously to Ava in the rearview mirror. Home, Nicholas said, the word feeling strange in his mouth. His penthouse had never been a home, merely a place he slept between conquering the business world. But tonight, it would have to be more than that. As the car pulled away from the curb, Nicholas finally opened the envelope. Inside was a single page, covered in Caroline's handwriting. Nicholas, if you're reading this, I'm gone. Ava is yours. She has no one else. Please don't let her be alone. I know this comes as a shock, and I'm sorry for that. I made my choice years ago, thinking it was best for everyone. Maybe I was wrong. She's a good kid, Nicholas. She deserves better than what I could give her alone. She deserves you too. Caroline. Nicholas felt the letter tremble in his hands. He folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope, aware of Ava watching him from the other side of the car. She was sick for a long time, Ava said quietly, looking out the window at the passing city lights. She tried really hard to get better. Nicholas didn't know what to say. Words had always come easily to him in boardrooms and business negotiations. But here, with this small person claiming to be his flesh and blood, he was at a loss. I look like you, Ava continued, turning those gray eyes back to him. Mom always said so. She said I got your stubbornness too. Despite himself, Nicholas felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Determination, he corrected, not stubbornness. Ava shrugged. That's what Mom called it too. The car pulled up to Nicholas's building, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that pierced the Manhattan skyline. The doorman's eyes widened slightly at the sight of Ava, but quickly resumed his professional demeanor. Good evening, Mr. Carter, he said, opening the door. In the elevator, Ava stood quietly beside Nicholas, her small backpack clutched to her chest. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of the building, offering panoramic views of the city through floor-to-ceiling windows. Wow, Ava breathed as they stepped inside. The space was sleek and minimalist, all clean lines, neutral colors, and expensive furniture that looked as if it had never been used. Do you live here all by yourself? Yes, Nicholas answered, removing his jacket and hanging it precisely in the coat closet. Ava wandered into the living room, her eyes wide. It's like a museum, she said, carefully setting her backpack down on the pristine white sofa. Are you allowed to touch things? The question caught Nicholas off guard. Of course, he said. It's my home. Ava looked unconvinced. She stood awkwardly in the center of the room, suddenly looking very small and out of place in this sterile environment. Are you hungry? Nicholas asked, realizing he had no idea how to care for a child. Ava nodded. A little. Nicholas led her to the kitchen, a designer showcase of stainless steel and marble that had rarely seen actual cooking. He opened the refrigerator, revealing mostly empty shelves. I usually eat out, he explained, feeling strangely embarrassed by this admission. That's okay, Ava said. Do you have cereal? A search of the pantry produced a box of organic granola that Nicholas's housekeeper had purchased. Ava accepted it without complaint, though her expression suggested it wasn't what she'd had in mind. As she ate at the kitchen island, Nicholas studied her surreptitiously. The resemblance was undeniable, not just the eyes, but the shape of her chin, the set of her jaw. Could it be true? Could Caroline have hidden his own child from him all these years? I need to make some calls, Nicholas said, retreating to his home office. Once alone, he sank into his chair and loosened his tie, a rare gesture of vulnerability. This was uncharted territory. There would be DNA tests, of course, legal procedures. But in his gut, he already knew the truth. He had a daughter who had just lost her mother, a daughter who was now, unexpectedly and inconveniently, his responsibility. When he returned to the kitchen, Ava had finished eating and was carefully washing her bowl in the sink. You don't need to do that, Nicholas said. The housekeeper will take care of it. Ava shrugged. Mom taught me to clean up after myself. Caroline again? Nicholas felt a pang of something unfamiliar. Regret, perhaps? He pushed the feeling aside. You should get some sleep, he said, glancing at his watch. It's late. He showed her to the guest room, a space as impersonal as the rest of the penthouse. The bathroom is through there, he said, gesturing to a door. There are new toothbrushes in the cabinet. Ava nodded, setting her backpack on the edge of the bed. Thank you, she said formally, as if speaking to a stranger, which, Nicholas realized with a jolt, he was to her. We'll figure this out tomorrow, he said, hovering awkwardly in the doorway. Good night. Good night, Ava replied softly. As Nicholas turned to leave, her voice stopped him. Mr. Carter, I'm sorry about your important meeting. The men in suits looked mad when they left. Nicholas turned back, surprised by her perceptiveness. Don't worry about that, he said. Business is business. Ava nodded, but didn't look convinced. Mom said you were very important, that you were always busy making deals. She hesitated. That's why she never told you about me. She said you had important things to do. Nicholas felt something shift inside him, a tectonic plate moving beneath the carefully constructed foundation of his life. Your mother made that decision, he said carefully. Not me. I know, Ava said, but she thought it was best. She looked down at her hands. She was trying to protect both of us, I think. Nicholas didn't know how to respond to that. Instead, he nodded curtly and left, closing the door behind him. Instead, he thought about Caroline, about the whirlwind romance they'd shared before his career took off, about how she'd left so suddenly, with only a brief note explaining that she needed to find her own path. Had she known then that she was pregnant? Had she deliberately kept his child from him? And why now? Why had she instructed Ava to find him after her death? The question swirled in his mind, preventing sleep. Around 3 a.m, he found himself standing outside the guest room door, listening for any sound. Hearing nothing, he carefully opened the door a crack. Ava was curled up on top of the covers, still fully dressed, her small form barely making an impression on the king-sized bed. Her face in sleep was peaceful, innocent, untouched by the complications of the adult world that had brought her here. Nicholas closed the door quietly and returned to his room. Tomorrow would bring DNA tests, lawyers, and uncomfortable explanations to his board of directors. Tomorrow would be about taking back control of this situation. But for tonight, in the quiet darkness of his penthouse, Nicholas Carter faced a truth he had never anticipated. He was a father, and nothing in his meticulously planned life had prepared him for that. If you enjoyed this shocking revelation, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Comment below to let us know where you're watching from. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across Nicholas's immaculate living room. He had been awake for hours, making calls, sending emails, damage control. The Peterson deal was hanging by a thread. His board members were demanding explanations, and his PR team was on high alert. But none of that seemed as important as the DNA test results glowing on his laptop screen. 99.9997% probability of paternity. Nicholas closed the laptop slowly, the click of its lid echoing in the silent penthouse. He had rushed the test, pulling strings and paying an exorbitant fee to get results within 24 hours. Now, faced with the irrefutable truth, he felt strangely hollow. He had a daughter. Ava was his child. A soft patting of feet made him look up. Ava stood in the doorway of the guest room, her hair rumpled from sleep, still wearing yesterday's clothes. "Good morning," she said cautiously, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar space. "Good morning," Nicholas replied, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. He cleared his throat. "Are you hungry?" Ava nodded. "Do you have any cereal? Not the bird food kind from last night?" Despite himself, Nicholas felt a smile tug at the corners of his mouth. "I'll have something delivered." He reached for his phone, then hesitated. "What kind of cereal do you like?" "Lucky Charms," Ava answered without hesitation. "Mom only let me have them on Saturdays. She said they were basically candy." She wasn't wrong, Nicholas muttered, but ordered them anyway, along with milk, orange juice, and a selection of other breakfast items he thought a child might enjoy. While they waited, an uncomfortable silence settled between them. Nicholas was used to commanding rooms full of powerful executives, but facing this small person left him at a loss for words. Finally, Ava spoke. "So, what happens now? Are you sending me back today?" Nicholas looked at her, really looked at her. Gone was the confident girl from the restaurant. In her place stood a child trying desperately to be brave. "I've been making some calls," he said carefully. "I've spoken to your social worker. There are processes that need to be followed." Ava's face fell. "Oh." She fiddled with the hem of her dress. "That's okay. I understand." "No, I don't think you do," Nicholas said. He took a deep breath. "Ava, I've seen the test results. You are my daughter." She looked up sharply. "You didn't believe me before?" "It's not that simple," Nicholas explained. "In my world, people sometimes try to take advantage. I needed to be sure." "And now you're sure," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Nicholas confirmed, "and that means I have a responsibility to you, a legal one, at the very least." Ava studied him with those gray eyes, his eyes, that seemed to see straight through him. "You don't have to take me if you don't want to," she said quietly. "Mom said you might not want a kid. She said your work is really important." Something in Nicholas's chest constricted painfully. "Your mother shouldn't have made that decision for me," he said, surprising himself with the heat in his voice. "She should have told me about you. She was trying to protect you, Ava said simply. And me too, I think. Before Nicholas could respond, his phone buzzed. The doorman was sending up their breakfast delivery. Grateful for the interruption, Nicholas went to meet the delivery person at the elevator. When he returned with the bags of food, Ava was standing by the windows, gazing out at the city below. It's like being in a castle tower up here, she said, not turning around. Do you ever feel like a king looking down at everyone? The question caught Nicholas off guard. Did this child somehow understand the power he wielded in his corporate empire? The thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended on his decisions? No, he said honestly. I don't think about it that way. Ava turned to him, her expression serious. Mom said you were the smartest person she ever met, that you always knew exactly what you wanted. She paused. Do you want me to stay? Nicholas set the bags down on the kitchen counter. It's more complicated than what I want, Ava. There are legal considerations. Your welfare is the priority here. That's not an answer, Ava said, with a directness that reminded Nicholas uncomfortably of himself. The doorbell rang, interrupting them again. Nicholas glanced at the security panel, surprised. He wasn't expecting anyone else. It's my lawyer, he said, buzzing her in. We have some things to discuss. Why don't you have breakfast while we talk? Ava nodded, moving to the kitchen and investigating the bags of food with interest. Nicholas's lawyer, Diane Matthews, was a formidable woman in her 50s who had guided him through countless business negotiations. Her eyebrows rose slightly at the sight of the child eating Lucky Charms at Nicholas's pristine kitchen island, but she made no comment. Let's speak in my office, Nicholas said, leading her to a room with glass walls overlooking the living area. He could still see Ava, but their conversation would be private. I've reviewed everything, Diane said, opening her briefcase and pulling out a folder. Birth certificate, death certificate, custody documents. It's all in order. Caroline Mitchell named you as the father, but she maintains sole legal custody. There was never any child support, filing, or legal acknowledgement from you. Because I didn't know, Nicholas said tersely. She never told me. Diane nodded, unperturbed by his tone. That's clear from the documentation. Her will is straightforward. She names you as Ava's guardian in the event of her death, but there was no formal agreement from you. That's why the state stepped in initially. And now, Nicholas asked, now that paternity is confirmed, you have legal rights as her father, but taking custody is not automatic. The court will want to ensure you're a suitable guardian. She glanced through the glass at Ava, who was now exploring the living room, careful not to touch anything. It's a significant commitment, Nicholas. Your lifestyle, your work schedule, these are not conducive to raising a child. Nicholas bristled. Are you suggesting I'm incapable of caring for my own daughter? I'm suggesting that you consider all options, Diane replied evenly. Caroline's sister has expressed interest in taking Ava. She's already raised 2 children of her own. She has a stable home, a husband, a support system. Her aunt? Nicholas frowned. Caroline never mentioned a sister. They were estranged for many years, but reconciled before Caroline's death. She lives in Connecticut. The social worker thinks it might be the least disruptive option for Ava. Nicholas looked out at Ava, who had discovered his collection of art books and was flipping through one with careful hands. An unfamiliar feeling stirred in him, something possessive, protective. She's my daughter, he said quietly. I missed 7 years of her life because of Caroline's decision. I won't miss any more. Diane studied him for a moment. This isn't a business acquisition, Nicholas. You can't just decide you want her and make it happen. There will be home studies, interviews, court appearances. Your entire life will be scrutinized. Then scrutinize it, Nicholas said coldly. I have nothing to hide. What about the Peterson deal, the Melbourne merger, your trip to Singapore next week? Are you prepared to put all of that on hold while you go through this process, while you learn to be a parent? For once in his life, Nicholas didn't have an immediate answer. His career, his empire, these had been the focus of his existence for so long. Could he really set them aside, even temporarily, for a child he'd only just met? The answer came to him with surprising clarity. I'll make it work, Diane sighed, recognizing the determination in his voice. I'll file the paperwork today. But, Nicholas, she hesitated. Are you sure this is about what's best for Ava? Not just what you want? Nicholas met her gaze steadily. For once in my life, Diane, those might be the same thing. After Diane left, Nicholas found Ava sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by his collection of first edition books. His initial instinct was irritation. Those books were valuable, not playthings. But the careful way she turned the pages, her complete absorption in the stories, stopped his reprimand before it began. "You have a lot of books," Ava said, looking up at him. "Mom loved books too. She read to me every night." Nicholas felt a pang of something like guilt. "What kind of books do you like?" "Adventures," Ava said immediately. "And mysteries. Mom was reading Harry Potter to me before she—" Her voice trailed off, and she looked back down at the book in her lap. Nicholas sat down cautiously on the edge of the sofa near her. "Ava, I need to talk to you about something important." She closed the book carefully and waited, her expression guarded. "I've spoken with my lawyer and your social worker. There are some decisions that need to be made about where you'll live now." Ava nodded as if she'd been expecting this. "Is it with Aunt Maggie? She said I might go live with her and Uncle Peter." "You know your aunt?" Nicholas asked, surprised. "She came to visit Mom a lot when she was sick," Ava explained. "She's nice. She has 2 kids, but they're older than me, teenagers." Nicholas felt an irrational surge of jealousy toward this woman, who knew more about his daughter's life than he did. "Would you like to live with them?" Ava shrugged, trying to appear indifferent, though her fingers nervously pleated the edge of her dress. "It doesn't matter what I want. Grown-ups decide these things." The simple resignation in her voice struck Nicholas hard. He thought of his own childhood, the decisions made for him, the paths chosen by others. Wasn't that why he had built his life around control? To never again be at the mercy of someone else's choices? "It does matter what you want," Nicholas said firmly. "Your opinion is important in this decision." Ava looked at him skeptically. "Really?" "Really," Nicholas confirmed. "So I'm asking you, would you prefer to live with your aunt and uncle, or—" He hesitated, then committed. "Or would you consider staying here, with me?" Ava's eyes widened. "You want me to stay with you?" "I'm your father," Nicholas said, the words still strange on his tongue. "And while I don't know much about being a parent, I'm willing to learn, if that's what you want." Ava stared at him for a long moment, those gray eyes, his eyes, searching his face for sincerity. "But what about your important work, your deals and stuff? Mom said you have meetings all the time." "I do," Nicholas acknowledged, "but arrangements can be made. Things can change." "Because of me?" Ava asked, her voice small. "Yes," Nicholas said simply. "Because of you." Ava seemed to consider this deeply, her young face serious with thought. "I think," she began cautiously, "I think I'd like to try staying with you, if that's okay." Relief washed over Nicholas, a sensation so unexpected that it nearly took his breath away. "It's okay," he assured her. "More than okay." For the first time since she'd appeared in the restaurant, Ava smiled, a real smile that transformed her solemn little face. "Do I call you Dad then? Or Nicholas? Or Mr. Carter?" Nicholas swallowed hard. "Dad is fine," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "If you're comfortable with that." Ava nodded thoughtfully. "I might need to practice. I never had a dad before." "And I never had a daughter," Nicholas admitted. "So we'll learn together." The moment was interrupted by Nicholas's phone buzzing insistently. James Peterson's name flashed on the screen. "You should answer that," Ava said, noticing his hesitation. "Mom always said it's rude to ignore calls." Nicholas smiled slightly. "Your mother was right about a lot of things." He picked up the phone. "Peterson, I was going to call you today." "I hope so." Peterson's voice was cool. "Yesterday's interruption was concerning, to say the least. My board is questioning whether your focus is where it needs to be for a deal of this magnitude." Nicholas glanced at Ava, who had returned to her book, pretending not to listen. "My focus is exactly where it needs to be, Peterson. But there have been some personal developments that require my attention." "Personal developments?" Peterson repeated skeptically. "Carter, in the 15 years I've known you, you've never had personal developments. You're a machine. That's why we considered this deal in the first place." "Things change," Nicholas said simply. "Not men like you," Peterson countered. "What's really going on?" Nicholas took a deep breath. "I've recently discovered I have a daughter. Her mother passed away, and she's now in my care. It's a transition period. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. A daughter? Peterson finally said. The girl from the restaurant? Yes, Nicholas confirmed. She's 7. Another long pause. I see. Peterson's voice had lost some of its edge. And this is a permanent arrangement? Yes, Nicholas said, the certainty in his voice surprising even himself. But it won't affect the deal. I'll have the revised proposal on your desk by the end of the week. That won't be necessary, Peterson said. We'll push the timeline back, give you a chance to adjust. Nicholas blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected accommodation. I appreciate that, James. I have 3 kids of my own, Peterson said, his tone softening slightly. The first few months are the hardest, especially with a girl. He cleared his throat. We'll touch base next month, see where things stand. After the call ended, Nicholas sat quietly, processing what had just happened. In a single conversation, the fearsome James Peterson had shown more humanity than Nicholas had witnessed in years of business dealings, all because of a little girl reading quietly on his living room floor. Is everything okay? Ava asked, looking up from her book. You look funny. Nicholas smiled, a real smile, not the calculated one he used in boardrooms. Everything is fine, better than fine, actually. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from his assistant. The board was requesting an emergency meeting to discuss recent developments. His calendar for the day was packed with appointments that couldn't easily be rescheduled. The Melbourne team was waiting for his decision on the factory acquisition. The world of Nicholas Carter, CEO, continued to turn, demanding his attention. But for the first time in his career, Nicholas found himself prioritizing something else, someone else. Ava, he said, setting his phone aside. How would you feel about going shopping today? You'll need some things if you're going to stay here. Ava brightened. Really? Now? Really? Now? Nicholas stood, making a decision. Just let me make one more call. He stepped into his office and dialed his assistant. Jennifer, cancel everything for today and tomorrow. Actually, clear my schedule for the rest of the week. The rest of the week? Jennifer repeated, sounding alarmed. But sir, the board meeting can wait, Nicholas finished firmly. Tell them I'm dealing with a family matter. A family matter, Jennifer echoed doubtfully. Is everything all right, Mr. Carter? Nicholas looked through the glass wall at Ava, who was carefully returning the books to their exact positions on the shelf. Yes, he said. For the first time in a very long time, I think it might be. The next few hours were unlike anything Nicholas had experienced before. Together, they visited department stores, children's boutiques, and a massive toy store that Ava explored with wide-eyed wonder. Nicholas found himself buying things he'd never imagined would enter his home. Colorful bedding, stuffed animals, games, and books. So many books. Are you sure this isn't too much? Ava asked as they loaded the last of the bags into Nicholas's car. Mom said we have to be careful with money. Nicholas felt a surge of tenderness mixed with sadness. How different Ava's life had been from what he could have provided. We don't have to worry about that, he assured her. But it's good to remember that there are more important things than possessions. Ava nodded solemnly. Like family? Yes, Nicholas said softly. Like family. That evening, as Ava arranged her new treasures in what was now officially her room, Nicholas stood in the doorway, watching. The sterile guest room was transforming before his eyes, becoming warmer, more vibrant, filled with personality. Do you think it looks nice? Ava asked anxiously, searching his face for approval. Nicholas nodded, unable to speak for a moment. He had built skyscrapers, merged corporations, moved markets with his decisions. But nothing had ever filled him with the strange mixture of terror and joy that he felt looking at this little girl who was suddenly his responsibility, his daughter. It looks perfect, he said finally. Ava beamed, then frowned slightly. I wish Mom could see it. She always wanted me to have a nice room. Her voice wavered. Do you think she knows? Nicholas had never been a spiritual man, but in that moment, he found himself wanting to believe, for Ava's sake, for his own. I think she does, he said gently, and I think she'd be very proud of how brave you've been. Ava's eyes filled with tears. I miss her. I know, Nicholas said, crossing the room to sit beside her on the bed. And that's okay. You'll always miss her. But it will get easier to remember the happy times. Ava leaned against him tentatively, and Nicholas found himself putting an arm around her small shoulders. They sat in silence for a moment, this newly formed family finding comfort in each other's presence. "Dad?" Ava said quietly, testing the word. "Yes?" Nicholas answered, his heart doing a strange flip at the sound. "I'm glad I found you." In that moment, Nicholas Carter, the cold, calculating businessman who valued efficiency over emotion, who had built an empire on control and precision, felt something inside him shift permanently. "I'm glad you found me too," he whispered, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The first week passed in a blur of adjustments and discoveries. Nicholas's sleek, minimalist penthouse, once a showcase of understated luxury, was slowly transforming. Colorful drawings appeared on the refrigerator door, held by whimsical magnets. A collection of stuffed animals took up residence on the living room couch. Bookshelves that had once displayed first editions and investment guides now made room for Harry Potter and the Chronicles of Narnia. But the most significant change wasn't in the physical space. It was in Nicholas himself. He found himself working from home more often, laptop balanced on the kitchen counter as he supervised Ava's breakfast. Meetings were rescheduled around school visits and pediatrician appointments. The famous Nicholas Carter efficiency was still present, but it now operated on a different schedule, Ava's schedule. "You're different," James Peterson remarked during a video call that Nicholas took from his home office. In the background, Ava could be seen at the dining table, concentrating on her homework. "Not in a bad way," Peterson clarified, noticing Nicholas's expression. "Just different." Nicholas glanced over his shoulder at Ava, who was biting her lip in concentration as she worked through a math problem. "Priorities change," he said simply. His board members and executive team were less understanding. Nicholas could see it in their faces during meetings, the concern, the whispers, the sidelong glances. Nicholas Carter, the man who had built an empire through relentless focus and single-minded determination, was suddenly leaving the office by 6, declining weekend conferences, and talking about elementary school considerations. "It's temporary," Thomas Wagner, his CFO, assured the others when Nicholas left a budget meeting early to pick Ava up from her first day at her new school. "He'll get the kids settled and hire a nanny, then things will go back to normal." But Nicholas had no intention of things going back to normal, because for the first time in his adult life, he was beginning to question what normal should be. The collision of his two worlds, the cold, calculated business realm and the warm, messy reality of parenthood, created constant friction. There were moments when Nicholas felt completely out of his depth, like when Ava asked him to explain why her mother had to die, or when she woke crying from nightmares he couldn't chase away. "You're doing fine," Jennifer, his assistant, assured him after he called her in a panic, because Ava had a fever of 101, and he didn't know if that warranted an emergency room visit. "Children get sick. That's normal." "Nothing about this is normal," Nicholas had growled, pacing his living room while Ava slept fitfully on the couch, surrounded by tissues and half-drunk glasses of water. But despite the challenges, there were moments of unexpected joy that caught Nicholas completely by surprise. The way Ava's face lit up when he managed to make pancakes without burning them. The sound of her laughter when they discovered a mutual love for old Looney Tunes cartoons. The feeling of her small hand slipping into his as they walked through Central Park on a crisp autumn day. "Can we feed the ducks?" she asked, pointing to the pond where several birds glided across the water. "I don't have any bread," Nicholas replied, mentally calculating how quickly they could find a vendor selling something appropriate. Ava reached into her pocket and pulled out a small bag. "I brought some. Mom always said to be prepared." Nicholas stared at her, this tiny person with her practical solutions and thoughtful preparation, so different from the hard-driving executives he surrounded himself with, yet somehow more impressive in her simple wisdom. "Your mother was a smart woman," he said softly. Ava nodded, her expression solemn. "She said I'm smart like both of you." She looked up at him with those familiar gray eyes. "She wasn't mad at you, you know, about not being there. She said it was her choice." Nicholas swallowed hard. "Did she tell you much about me?" "Some things," Ava said, tossing breadcrumbs to the eager ducks. "She kept a box with your picture and some letters. and newspaper articles about your company. She glanced at him. She was proud of you, I think. The thought of Caroline following his career from afar, sharing pieces of him with their daughter, while keeping Ava's existence a secret, filled Nicholas with a complicated mixture of emotions: anger, sadness, regret, but mostly a profound sense of loss for the years he could never get back. "I wish I had known about you sooner," he said. Ava shrugged with the simple acceptance of childhood. "But you know now." On their way home, they stopped at a small Italian restaurant, nothing like the five-star establishments Nicholas usually frequented. But Ava had pointed at it excitedly, declaring, "They have mac and cheese. Real mac and cheese. Not the fancy kind with the crunchy stuff on top." So they sat in a booth with red checkered tablecloths, Ava happily twirling pasta on her fork, while Nicholas discovered that simple food and good company was more satisfying than any business dinner he could remember. "Do you like your job?" Ava asked suddenly, looking up from her meal. Nicholas considered the question. No one had asked him that in years, perhaps ever. His success was so absolute that people assumed satisfaction came with it. "It's challenging," he answered carefully. "I built my company from nothing. It's important to me." Ava nodded, considering this. "But do you like it? Does it make you happy?" Happy. Another concept that had been absent from Nicholas's calculated existence for so long. He had been successful, respected, feared even. But happy? Parts of it, he admitted. "I like solving problems, making things work better." "Mom said you're very good at fixing things," Ava said, pushing her empty plate away. "She said you could fix anything except your own heart." She tilted her head. What did she mean by that? Nicholas felt as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. Caroline had always seen through him, even at the beginning, had recognized the walls he'd built around himself, the emotional distance he maintained to protect the vulnerable core he'd buried so deeply, he sometimes forgot it existed. "I think," he said slowly, "she meant that I spent so much time working on business problems that I forgot to work on myself." Ava considered this with the serious expression she wore when processing new information. "Are you fixing that now?" Nicholas smiled slightly. "I'm trying." When they returned to the penthouse, Ava went to take a bath, a routine she insisted she could handle herself, though Nicholas waited anxiously outside the door, ready to rush in at the slightest splash or thud. While she was occupied, he retreated to his office to check emails. Hundreds had accumulated during their day out. Urgent requests, contract questions, meeting invitations. The never-ending demands of an empire that had once been his entire focus. He was halfway through sorting them when he heard it. A sharp cry from the bathroom, followed by silence. Nicholas moved faster than he ever had in his life, covering the distance from his office to the bathroom in seconds, heart pounding in his chest. "Ava!" he called, knocking sharply. When there was no immediate answer, he opened the door without hesitation. Ava sat on the edge of the tub, fully dressed in her pajamas, tears streaming down her face. She held her arm awkwardly, and a small trickle of blood ran from a cut on her elbow. "I slipped," she explained through her tears. "I tried to reach my book and I slipped on the water on the floor." Relief flooded through Nicholas, immediately followed by concern. He knelt beside her, gently examining her arm. "Can you move your fingers? Does it hurt when I touch here?" Ava winced slightly, but demonstrated that she could move everything. "It's just a cut," she said, attempting bravery. "I'm not a baby." "No, you're not," Nicholas agreed, reaching for the first aid kit he'd installed in every bathroom after her arrival. "You're very tough, but it's okay to cry when you're hurt." He cleaned the cut carefully, applied antibiotic ointment, and covered it with a colorful bandage that had been part of the extensive supplies the pediatrician had recommended. "There," he said, pressing a gentle kiss to the bandage before he could overthink the gesture. "All better." Ava looked at him with wide eyes, then threw her arms around his neck in a fierce hug. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. Nicholas froze for a moment, then slowly wrapped his arms around her small form. Something warm and unfamiliar bloomed in his chest, a feeling so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. For the first time, he understood. This wasn't a responsibility or an obligation. This wasn't a problem to be solved or a situation to be managed. This was love. Later that night, After tucking Ava into bed with extra care for her injured arm, Nicholas sat alone in his living room, nursing a glass of whiskey. His phone buzzed with a message from Diane, his lawyer. Custody hearing set for next month. Judge Harriman assigned a case. Solid reputation, fair but thorough. Prep meeting tomorrow, 2 p.m. Nicholas stared at the message, a cold feeling settling in his stomach. Despite the progress of the last few weeks, despite the connection growing between him and Ava, her future wasn't secure. The court would evaluate his suitability as a parent. They would consider his work schedule, his lack of experience, his lifestyle. And they would also hear from Ava's Aunt Maggie, a woman with a stable home, a husband, experience raising children, a woman who represented everything Nicholas was not. What if they decided he wasn't what was best for Ava? What if all of this, the tentative trust they were building, the small routines they were establishing, the new world they were creating together, was taken away? The thought was unbearable. Nicholas set down his glass and went to check on Ava one more time. She was sleeping peacefully, one arm flung above her head, the bandaged elbow visible in the soft light from the hallway. Her stuffed rabbit, a purchase from their first shopping trip, was tucked securely beside her. As he watched her sleep, Nicholas made a silent promise. He would not lose her. Whatever it took, whatever he needed to change or become, he would do it. Because somewhere in the journey from that first shocking daddy, in the restaurant to this quiet moment in a bedroom filled with children's books and stuffed animals, Nicholas Carter, the cold, calculating businessman who had built an empire on control and precision, had discovered something far more valuable than any deal he'd ever closed. He had discovered his heart. The next morning, the peaceful routine they'd established was disrupted by an urgent call from Jennifer. "Sir, the board has called an emergency meeting. They're demanding your presence. It's about the Melbourne merger. Gibson is threatening to pull out unless you personally assure him the deal is still on track." Nicholas glanced at Ava, who was contentedly eating breakfast at the kitchen island, swinging her legs as she paged through a book. "I can't come in today. I have Ava." "Sir?" Jennifer's voice held a note of desperation. "They're talking about invoking the leadership contingency clause. If Gibson walks away, the stock will plummet. The board is concerned about your priorities." The implications were clear. The empire Nicholas had spent 15 years building was at risk of slipping from his grasp because of his divided attention. 6 weeks ago, such a threat would have spurred him into immediate action. Nothing would have stood in the way of protecting his company. Now, he looked at Ava and hesitated. "I'll figure something out," he told Jennifer. "Tell them I'll call into the meeting." After hanging up, he approached Ava carefully. "I need to work today," he explained. "There's an important meeting I can't miss." Ava nodded, the wariness returning to her eyes, the look she'd had when they first met, when she wasn't sure if she could trust him. "That's okay. I can just read quietly. I won't bother you." "You never bother me," Nicholas assured her, feeling a stab of guilt nonetheless. "But this might take a while. I was thinking maybe you'd like to meet someone special while I work." Ava looked confused. "Who?" An hour later, Maggie Mitchell arrived at the penthouse. She was a softer, gentler version of Caroline, the same honey blonde hair, but with laugh lines around her eyes and a warmth in her expression that immediately put Nicholas on edge. This was the woman who wanted to take Ava away from him. "Thank you for coming," Nicholas said stiffly, shaking her hand at the door. "Thank you for calling," Maggie replied, her eyes taking in the penthouse, the evidence of Ava's presence now visible everywhere. "I've been worried about her." Ava approached cautiously, hovering behind Nicholas. "Hi, Aunt Maggie." Maggie knelt down to Ava's level, her smile gentle. "Hi, sweetheart. I've missed you." Nicholas watched as Ava moved forward to give her aunt a hug. The easy affection between them was both reassuring and threatening, proof that Ava had people who loved her, but also a reminder of the connections that existed before he entered her life. "I have an important work meeting," Nicholas explained to Ava. "Aunt Maggie is going to stay with you for a few hours. Is that okay?" Ava looked between the two adults, clearly sensing the tension. "Can we stay here? I want to show Aunt Maggie my new room." "Of course," Nicholas agreed quickly. "You can stay right here. I'll be in my office if you need anything." As he stepped away, Maggie touched his arm lightly. "Mr. Carter, I know this must be strange for you, finding out about Ava so suddenly. Taking on responsibility for a child you didn't know existed." Her eyes were kind but assessing. It's okay if it's too much. No one would blame you. Nicholas stiffened. It's not too much, he said coldly. She's my daughter. Yes, she is, Maggie agreed softly. But being a father is more than biology. It's a choice you make every day, in 1,000 small ways. She glanced at Ava, who was watching them with those perceptive gray eyes. Caroline wanted what was best for her. That's all I want too. Before Nicholas could respond, his phone buzzed insistently. The board was waiting. I need to take this, he said tersely. Ava, show Aunt Maggie your books. I'll be done as soon as I can. He retreated to his office, closing the door behind him. Through the glass wall, he could see Ava leading Maggie toward her bedroom, chattering animatedly about something. For the next 3 hours, Nicholas fought the most difficult battle of his business career. The board members were united in their concern, the investors were demanding reassurance, and Gibson was threatening to walk away from a deal that had been months in the making. Your personal situation is unfortunate, Spencer Graves, the board chairman, said coldly. But the company must come first. Our shareholders expect nothing less. Nicholas felt something snap inside him, a breaking point he hadn't known was approaching. My personal situation, he said icily, is my daughter. And no, the company doesn't come first, not anymore. A shocked silence fell over the virtual meeting. Perhaps you should consider a leave of absence, Graves suggested, his tone making it clear this wasn't merely a suggestion. Until your situation is stabilized. Nicholas looked through the glass wall of his office. Ava and Maggie had moved to the living room, where they were engaged in what appeared to be an intense game of Uno. Ava's face was animated, her laughter visible even from a distance. In that moment, Nicholas Carter, the man who had sacrificed everything for success, who had built walls around his heart to protect himself from vulnerability, made a decision that shocked even himself. No, he said calmly. I won't be taking a leave of absence, but I will be restructuring my role, effective immediately. By the time the meeting ended, Nicholas had outlined a plan that would have been unthinkable 6 weeks ago. He would transition to chairman, stepping back from day-to-day operations. His COO, Michael Chen, would assume the role of CEO. Nicholas would remain involved in major decisions and strategy, but his 70-hour work weeks were over. He had chosen Ava. When he finally emerged from his office, Maggie was preparing to leave. She studied his face with quiet perceptiveness. Tough meeting? Nicholas nodded, suddenly exhausted. You could say that. Dad! Ava bounced up from the couch, waving a sheet of paper. Aunt Maggie helped me draw our family tree. Look, you're here, and Mom is here, and Grandma and Grandpa Mitchell are here. Nicholas took the paper, studying the carefully drawn lines connecting names and small stick figures. His name stood alone on one side, no parents or siblings branching from it. Your side is kind of empty, Ava observed. Don't you have any family? The innocent question hit Nicholas like a physical blow. Once, he had. Parents who had died too young, leaving him to navigate the world alone. A grandfather who had taken him in, but never quite known how to show affection. All gone now, leaving him to build his life around achievements rather than connections. Until Ava. I have you, he said simply. Maggie watched this exchange with a thoughtful expression. Ava, honey, why don't you go get that book you wanted to show me, the one about the dragons? Once Ava had disappeared down the hallway, Maggie turned to Nicholas. She seems happy, she said carefully. More settled than I expected. Nicholas stiffened, anticipating a challenge. She is settled. This is her home now. Maggie nodded slowly. I can see that, and I can see something else too. She gestured around the penthouse at the evidence of Ava's presence in what had once been a sterile showcase. You're changing your life for her. Yes, Nicholas said simply. That's what parents do, Maggie said, a hint of approval in her voice. Caroline would be surprised, but pleased, I think. Before Nicholas could respond, Ava returned with her book, and the moment passed. But something had shifted in the atmosphere, a tentative truce perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. Later that night, after Maggie had left with a promise to visit again soon, Nicholas sat on the edge of Ava's bed for their nightly reading ritual. They were halfway through The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, with Ava hanging on every word, her eyes heavy with approaching sleep. Dad? she interrupted suddenly. Are you sad about your work? Nicholas paused in his reading, surprised by the question. What do you mean? I heard you on the phone, Ava explained. You sounded upset, and I heard you tell someone you were changing jobs. She fidgeted with the edge of her blanket. Is it because of me? Nicholas set the book aside, choosing his words carefully. It's because of us, he said finally. Because some things are more important than others. It took me a long time to understand that. Ava considered this, her expression serious. But you worked really hard for your company. Mom said you built it all by yourself. I did, Nicholas acknowledged, and I'm proud of that. But I've realized lately that I want to build something else now, something even more important. What? Ava asked. Nicholas smoothed her hair back from her forehead. A family. Ava's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. With me? With you, Nicholas confirmed. As he continued reading, Ava's eyes grew heavier until she finally drifted off to sleep. Nicholas closed the book gently and stood to leave, but paused when he noticed Ava's hand had clutched his sleeve in her sleep. Carefully, so as not to wake her, he settled back into the chair beside her bed. The emails could wait. The calls could wait. For now, this was exactly where he needed to be. And in the quiet of his daughter's bedroom, surrounded by stuffed animals and children's books, Nicholas Carter felt something he had chased his entire life without ever truly finding: peace. As the custody hearing approached, Nicholas found himself confronting the past he had so carefully avoided for years. Caroline's death had left a trail of questions that needed answers, not just for the court, but for himself, and for Ava. I need to understand what happened, he told Diane as they prepared for the hearing. The whole story, not just the version I've been telling myself. With Ava spending the day with her new tutor, a gentle grandmotherly woman who was helping her catch up on schoolwork she'd missed during her mother's illness, Nicholas journeyed to the modest apartment in Queens where Caroline had spent her final years. The property manager let him in reluctantly, eyeing his expensive suit with suspicion. Miss Mitchell was a good tenant, the woman said, unlocking the door. Always paid on time, even when she got sick. The little girl was quiet, never caused any trouble. She handed Nicholas the key. You have until the end of the month to clear everything out. Nicholas stepped into the small two-bedroom apartment and immediately felt Caroline's presence. The colorful throw pillows on the worn couch, the collection of art books on the shelves, the framed photographs of Ava at various ages. This had been a home in a way his penthouse never was, until recently. He moved through the rooms slowly, taking in the evidence of the life Caroline had built without him. In Ava's bedroom, bright yellow walls and hand-painted butterflies created a cheerful space despite the clearly second-hand furniture. A desk in the corner held neatly stacked school books and a collection of certificates: Student of the Month, Perfect Attendance, Reading Achievement. Ava had thrived here, despite what must have been difficult circumstances. Caroline had made sure of it. In the main bedroom, Nicholas found what he was looking for. A wooden box sat on the dresser, carved with intricate floral patterns. Inside were letters, some written on paper, others printed from emails, chronicling their relationship from the beginning. The early ones were full of passion and promise, two young people falling in love and dreaming of a future together. Then came the shift. Nicholas's increasing focus on his fledgling company, Caroline's growing concern that she was being left behind, her discovery of the pregnancy, her fear of telling him, her ultimate decision to leave. I can't ask him to choose, she had written in a journal entry Nicholas found at the bottom of the box. His dream is just taking flight. A baby would clip his wings. Perhaps someday when he's soared high enough, there will be room in his life for us. Until then, I will give our child what I can and tell her stories of her father who moves mountains. Nicholas sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the journal open in his hands. Caroline had made a choice, a misguided one perhaps, but one born of love, not malice. She had believed she was protecting his dreams, even as she built a life without him, and he had let her go without a fight. Had been so consumed with his ambition that he hadn't questioned her departure, hadn't searched for answers, hadn't even considered that there might be more to her decision than what she'd written in that brief goodbye note. How many other connections had he sacrificed on the altar of success? How many relationships had he allowed to wither because they couldn't compete with his drive to build his empire? Among Caroline's papers, Nicholas found medical records documenting her battle with the cancer that eventually took her life. She had fought for 3 years, aggressive treatments, experimental protocols, brief periods of remission followed by devastating returns of the disease, all while raising Ava alone, working when she could, creating a stable home for their daughter. The final documents were the most painful. A will naming Nicholas as Ava's guardian, a letter to her sister Maggie explaining her decision, and a sealed envelope with Nicholas's name on it, dated just 2 weeks before her death. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. "Nicholas, by the time you read this, I will be gone, and you will have met our daughter. I hope you can forgive me for keeping her from you all these years. It was wrong, I see that now, but at the time, I truly believed I was doing what was best for both of you. You were building your dream, and nothing was going to stand in your way. I knew a child would have derailed your plans, and I couldn't bear to be the reason your brilliant light was dimmed. So I made the hardest choice of my life, to raise our incredible daughter alone, to give you the freedom to become who you were meant to be. I've watched your rise from afar. Every success, every milestone, I've celebrated them all and shared them with Ava. Look, I would tell her, your father is changing the world. She has your determination, your intelligence, your ability to see solutions where others see only problems. She makes me proud every day just as you have. I didn't plan to die so young. I fought hard to stay for Ava's sake. But now I must entrust her to you, and in doing so, I give you both the chance I stole from you 7 years ago, the chance to be father and daughter. I don't know what kind of man you've become. The Nicholas I knew was brilliant and driven, but also capable of great tenderness when he allowed himself to be vulnerable. I hope that man is still there, beneath the success and the power and the wealth. Ava needs more than financial security. She needs love, patience, guidance. She needs a father who will see her worth beyond what she can achieve or accomplish, who will value her simply for being herself. Can you be that father, Nicholas? I have to believe you can. I have to believe that the connection between you will be strong enough to overcome the years of absence. I'm trusting you with my greatest treasure. Please don't let her forget me. And please, find room in your carefully controlled world for a little bit of chaos, a little bit of heart, with hope for both of you, Caroline." Nicholas folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Caroline had seen him so clearly, his ambition, his drive, his carefully constructed walls. She had made a terrible mistake in keeping Ava from him, but she had also given him a second chance, a chance to become more than the sum of his achievements. By the time he left the apartment, carrying a box of Ava's favorite books and toys, along with the letters and photographs that chronicled her early years, Nicholas had come to terms with a painful truth. Caroline was gone, and no amount of anger or regret could change that. All that mattered now was the future, his future with Ava. Back at the penthouse, he found her at the dining room table with her tutor, working on multiplication tables. Her face lit up when she saw him. "Dad, Ms. Roslin says I'm catching up super fast. I got all my 7s right." "That's great," Nicholas said, setting down the box he'd brought. "I picked up some of your things from your old apartment, books and toys you might have missed." Ava's expression turned somber. "Mom's stuff too?" "Some of it," Nicholas confirmed. "And I found these?" He handed her a stack of photographs, Caroline holding baby Ava, Caroline pushing toddler Ava on a swing, Caroline and Ava baking cookies in their small kitchen. "I thought we could get some frames and put them up here." Ava took the photos reverently, her eyes filling with tears. "Really? You don't mind having pictures of Mom around?" Nicholas knelt beside her chair, meeting her at eye level. "Of course not. She was an important part of your life, of both our lives. We should remember her." After the tutor left, they spent the evening going through the box together. Nicholas listened as Ava shared memories of each item, the stuffed rabbit Caroline had sewn herself, the shell collection from a rare beach trip, the jewelry box where Caroline had kept a lock of Ava's baby hair. "She kept all these letters you guys wrote," Ava said, holding up the bundle from the wooden box. "She used to read parts of them to me sometimes. The nice parts?" Nicholas smiled slightly. "Your mother and I cared for each other very much once upon a time. But then you got busy with your company," Ava said matter-of-factly, "and Mom decided to leave." Nicholas hesitated, unsure how much to share with a 7-year-old. "It was more complicated than that," he said finally. We both made choices. But the most important thing those choices led to was you. Ava considered this, turning one of the letters over in her hands. If she had told you about me back then, what would you have done? The question caught Nicholas off guard. What would he have done if Caroline had told him she was pregnant all those years ago? Would he have set aside his ambitions, his single-minded focus on success? Would he have embraced fatherhood as he was trying to do now? I don't know, he admitted honestly. I was different then, but I'd like to think I would have tried to be a good father. Ava nodded, accepting his answer. Mom said sometimes people need to grow into who they're supposed to be. Maybe you needed to be a big important CEO first, before you could be my dad. Out of the mouths of babes, Nicholas thought, astonished by her perception. Maybe you're right, he said softly. But I'm trying to be your dad now. That's what matters most to me. As he tucked her into bed that night, surrounded by the familiar treasures from her old home, Ava reached for his hand. Dad, are you scared about the court thing next week? Nicholas paused. He had been careful not to burden Ava with his concerns about the custody hearing, but clearly she had picked up on the tension. A little, he admitted, sitting on the edge of her bed. But Diane, my lawyer, thinks everything will work out fine. Aunt Maggie says the judge just wants what's best for me, Ava said, her expression serious. She says I might have to answer some questions. Nicholas felt a flicker of alarm. Has your aunt been talking to you about the hearing? Ava nodded. She called yesterday when you were on your work call. She said not to worry, that no matter what happens, I'll be with people who love me. The implication was clear. Maggie was still pursuing custody, despite the apparent truce of her visit. Nicholas fought down a surge of anger. This wasn't a business negotiation where he could simply outmaneuver his opponent. This was Ava's future, and his. Your aunt loves you very much, he said carefully. And so do I. The judge will decide where you'll live, but no matter what, you'll always have both of us in your life. The words cost him something to say, but Nicholas knew they were true. If, unthinkably, the judge ruled in Maggie's favor, he would not cut Ava out of his life. He would find a way to remain her father, even if he couldn't be her full-time parent. I want to stay with you, Ava said suddenly, her voice small but determined. I like it here. I like our bedtime stories and Saturday pancakes, and when you help me with my math, even though you get impatient sometimes. Nicholas felt his throat tighten. I want you to stay too, he managed. Then that's what I'll tell the judge, Ava said with the simple confidence of childhood, as if the matter were settled. If only it were that simple, Nicholas thought. The day of the custody hearing dawned clear and cold. Nicholas had been awake since 4, reviewing documents with Diane, preparing for every possible challenge. Ava, picked up earlier by a court-appointed guardian who would accompany her to the hearing, had been quiet but composed, dressed in the new outfit they had chosen together, a simple blue dress and cardigan that made her look both young and somehow older than her years. Remember, Nicholas had told her as they parted, tell the truth. That's all anyone wants to hear. Now, sitting in the family court waiting area, Nicholas felt more nervous than he had before any business negotiation in his life. His entire future, the one that mattered, not the one measured in stock prices and acquisitions, hung in the balance. Maggie arrived with her husband, a kind-faced man who nodded respectfully to Nicholas. She looked tired but determined, clutching a manila folder that presumably contained her own evidence of why she should raise Ava. Mr. Carter, she said formally, taking a seat across from him, I want you to know that whatever happens today, I believe Ava's welfare is the priority. For both of us. Nicholas nodded stiffly. Agreed. Diane leaned in, her voice low. Judge Harriman has reviewed all the documentation, home studies, character references, financial disclosures. He'll want to hear from both of you directly, and he'll speak with Ava privately in his chambers. She squeezed Nicholas's arm reassuringly. You've done everything right. The changes you've made to accommodate Ava's needs, your willingness to restructure your work life, these all demonstrate serious commitment. But would it be enough? Nicholas wondered. Could any judge look at him, a workaholic bachelor with no parenting experience, and see a better option than Maggie, with her stable marriage and history of raising children? Diane seemed to read his thoughts. Biology matters, she reminded him. You're her father. That counts for a lot. Before Nicholas could respond, his phone buzzed. A message from Jennifer. Emergency. Gibson pulling out a deal. Board meeting in progress. CEO vote imminent. Need response ASAP. Nicholas stared at the screen, a cold feeling spreading through his chest. The Melbourne merger, the deal he'd worked on for months, the cornerstone of his company's expansion plans, was collapsing in his absence. And the board, clearly deciding his family situation had compromised his leadership, was moving to replace him permanently. "Everything okay?" Diane asked, noticing his expression. Nicholas turned off his phone and slipped it into his pocket. "Fine," he said. "Just work." Carter Wiesen Mitchell, a court officer called. Judge Harriman's chambers. This was it, the moment that would determine the course of Ava's life, and his own. The judge's chambers were less formal than Nicholas had expected. Judge Harriman, a man in his 60s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, greeted them all politely and explained the process. "I've reviewed all the documentation submitted by both parties," he said, "and I've spoken with Ava's social worker and her court-appointed guardian. I'll be speaking with Ava herself shortly, but first, I'd like to hear from each of you." He turned to Maggie. "Mrs. Bedford, as the maternal aunt and the adult with whom Ava has the longest relationship, you may go first." Maggie spoke eloquently about her connection with Caroline, her relationship with Ava, her stable home environment, and her concerns about Nicholas's ability to provide the emotional support and consistency a young child needs. "Mr. Carter is obviously successful and intelligent," she concluded, "and I believe he cares for Ava, but caring isn't enough. Children need stability, routine, a parent who puts them first consistently. Mr. Carter's world has always been about business, about achievement. I worry that once the novelty wears off, or when the demands of his company become too pressing, Ava will be left with nannies and tutors while her father returns to what he knows best." Nicholas felt each word like a physical blow, not because they were untrue, but because they voiced his own deepest fears. What if he couldn't sustain this change? What if, despite his best intentions, he reverted to the man he had been before Ava came into his life? "Mr. Carter," the judge said, turning to him. "Your response?" Nicholas had prepared a careful speech, crafted with Diane to emphasize his legal rights as Ava's biological father, his financial ability to provide for her, the changes he had made to his home and schedule to accommodate her needs. But sitting there, under the judge's assessing gaze, Nicholas realized that none of those carefully prepared arguments mattered. Only the truth would do. "6 weeks ago," he began, "I didn't know I had a daughter. I had built my life around work, around achievement. I valued control above all else." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Then Ava walked into that restaurant and called me Daddy, and everything changed. Not all at once. I'm still learning, still adjusting. I make mistakes every day. I lose my patience when helping with homework. I panic over minor injuries. I'm learning to balance work demands with bedtime stories." Nicholas looked directly at the judge. "What Mrs. Bedford says is partly true. I don't have her experience or her established routine. But she's wrong about one thing. This isn't a novelty for me. This is the most important responsibility I've ever undertaken." He reached into his pocket and pulled out Caroline's letter. "Ava's mother made a choice years ago to keep my daughter from me. She thought she was protecting me, protecting my ambitions. She was wrong. I missed 7 years that I can never get back." His voice broke slightly, but he continued. "Today, right now, while I'm sitting here, my board of directors is voting to replace me as CEO. The deal I've worked on for months is falling apart. 6 weeks ago, that would have been unthinkable, a catastrophe. Today, it's a footnote." Nicholas leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Because the only thing that matters to me now is being Ava's father, not her financial provider, not her occasional visitor, her father. The person who helps with homework and makes pancakes on Saturdays and stays up all night when she has a fever." He took a deep breath. "I can't change the past. I can't be the father who was there from the beginning. But I can be the father she needs now and in the future. And I will move heaven and earth to be that man for her." A silence fell over the room when Nicholas finished speaking. Even Maggie looked affected, though she quickly composed herself. Judge Harriman studied Nicholas thoughtfully. "That's a moving speech, Mr. Carter. But as you've acknowledged, you've only been in Ava's life for 6 weeks. How can I be certain your commitment will endure when the challenges increase, when the demands of your business and the demands of parenthood inevitably clash. Before Nicholas could answer, there was a knock at the door. The court officer entered and whispered something to the judge, who nodded. "It seems Ava has something she wants to share with all of us," Judge Harriman said. "I was planning to speak with her privately, but she's been quite insistent." The door opened again, and Ava entered, accompanied by her guardian. She looked small and vulnerable in the large room, but her chin was raised with a determination that reminded Nicholas so strongly of himself that it took his breath away. "Your Honor," she said formally, as if she'd practiced the words, "I need to tell you something important." Judge Harriman smiled kindly. "Go ahead, Ava. We're all listening." Ava's eyes found Nicholas, and she gave him a small, encouraging smile before turning back to the judge. "My mom told me a lot about my dad before she died," she said clearly. "She said he was smart and strong and that he could solve any problem. She said he built a whole company by himself because he never gave up." She paused, gathering her thoughts just as Nicholas had done moments before. "When she got really sick, she told me to find him. She said he might not know how to be a dad right away, but that he would learn because he learns everything fast." Ava turned to look at Maggie. "I love Aunt Maggie. She took care of me when Mom was in the hospital. She makes good cookies and she knows all my favorite books." Then she looked at Nicholas and her eyes filled with tears. "But he's my dad, and he's trying really hard. He canceled his big meeting to take me shopping. He learned how to make pancakes even though he burned the first ones. He sits with me when I have bad dreams about Mom." She turned back to the judge, her expression earnest. "Mom always said that trying your best is what matters most, and he's trying his best to be my dad. I want to stay with him. Please." In that moment, Nicholas knew, whatever the judge decided, whatever the board voted, whatever became of his company or his career, he had already won the only victory that mattered. His daughter believed in him. Judge Harriman looked from Ava to Nicholas, then to Maggie, who was wiping away tears. "I think," the judge said slowly, "that we have some things to discuss." 2 hours later, Nicholas and Ava walked out of the courthouse together, hand in hand. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the steps as they descended toward the waiting car. "So, I get to stay with you forever?" Ava asked, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "For real?" Nicholas squeezed her small hand gently. "For real," he confirmed. The judge made it official. "You're stuck with me now?" Ava's face broke into a wide smile. "Good. I was worried he might decide differently." "Judge Harriman is very wise," Nicholas said. He understood what was most important. What the judge had ultimately decided was more nuanced than a simple victory for either party. Nicholas had been granted full legal custody of Ava, with the provision that Maggie would have regular visitation rights. The arrangement acknowledged both Nicholas's rights as Ava's father and the importance of maintaining her connection to her mother's family. Maggie had accepted the decision with grace, embracing Ava and whispering something in her ear that made her smile. To Nicholas's surprise, she had then approached him directly. "Take good care of her," she'd said simply, "and know that we're here if either of you need us." It was an olive branch, an acknowledgement that Ava's welfare mattered more than winning or losing. "I will," Nicholas had promised, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. Now, as they settled into the back seat of the car, Nicholas finally allowed himself to check his phone. 27 missed calls, 43 text messages, 6 voicemails. The board meeting had evidently concluded, and the fallout was waiting for him. "Something wrong?" Ava asked, noting his expression. Nicholas put the phone away. "Nothing that can't wait until tomorrow. Today is about celebrating. What would you like to do? Anything you want." Ava considered this offer seriously. "Can we get ice cream? And then maybe go to the bookstore? Mom always said bookstores are magical places." "Your mother was a wise woman," Nicholas said, directing the driver to their new destination. "Bookstore it is." Later that evening, after a day that included not only ice cream and books, but also a spontaneous visit to the Central Park Zoo, Nicholas and Ava returned to the penthouse. Ava, tired but happy, went to arrange her new books on the shelf in her room, while Nicholas finally faced the messages waiting on his phone. As he had suspected, the board had voted to remove him as CEO. Michael Chen had been appointed in his place, with Nicholas retaining his position as chairman, a role that carried influence but significantly less day-to-day responsibility. The Melbourne deal was indeed in jeopardy, with Gibson demanding personal assurances that the company's direction wouldn't change under new leadership. In a time that now seemed like another life, this professional upheaval would have been devastating to Nicholas. He would have fought back with every resource at his disposal, worked through the night to salvage the deal, called in favors and made threats to maintain his position. But now, reading the frantic messages, Nicholas felt only a calm certainty that he had made the right choice. His company would survive, might even thrive under Chen's leadership, and Nicholas would still guide its overall direction, still contribute his vision and experience. But he would do so on his own terms, with priorities rearranged to make room for what truly mattered. He called Chen directly, bypassing the board and the PR team and all the others clamoring for his attention. "Congratulations on the promotion," Nicholas said when Chen answered. "You've earned it." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "It wasn't how I wanted it to happen," Chen admitted. "The board's decision was hasty, but necessary," Nicholas finished. "They need a CEO who can give the company his full attention. That's not me anymore." "The Gibson deal," Chen began. "Call him directly," Nicholas advised. "Tell him I personally endorse the transition and that you'll be flying to Melbourne next week to finalize the details. He respects decisiveness." They discussed a few other pressing matters, then Chen hesitated. "If you don't mind me asking, was it worth it? Stepping back from everything you built?" Nicholas looked down the hallway, where he could see Ava sitting cross-legged on her bed, already absorbed in one of her new books. "More than I could have imagined," he said simply. After hanging up, Nicholas went to join Ava. She looked up from her book and scooted over to make room for him on the bed. "Is your work stuff okay?" she asked, her expression serious. Nicholas nodded. "Everything's fine. Some changes are happening at my company, but nothing to worry about." Ava studied his face carefully. "Are you sad about it? Mom said your company was like your baby." The question caught Nicholas off guard. Caroline had understood him well, perhaps better than he had understood himself. For years, his company had indeed been his child, the focus of his energy and pride and ambition. "I used to think my company was the most important thing in my life," he said carefully. "But now I know better." Ava smiled and leaned against his side, returning to her book. Nicholas put his arm around her shoulders, still marveling at how natural such gestures had become. In the weeks that followed, they settled into a new rhythm. Nicholas established a home office that allowed him to handle his chairman duties while remaining present for Ava. He attended board meetings and strategic planning sessions, but was home every evening for dinner. He learned to make more than just pancakes. His pasta sauce became a household favorite, though his attempts at baking remained disastrous. Ava began at a new school, where she quickly made friends and impressed her teachers with her intelligence and resilience. She joined the chess club and the junior science team, explaining to Nicholas that she wanted to be smart about lots of different things, like you and Mom. Their weekends became sacred time, museum visits, bike rides in the park, movie marathons on rainy days. Nicholas discovered a capacity for play he hadn't accessed since childhood, finding genuine joy in building elaborate pillow forts and engaging in epic Monopoly battles. Maggie and her family became regular visitors, the initial tension giving way to a comfortable relationship that enriched Ava's life. Nicholas even found himself enjoying their company, particularly when Maggie shared stories of Caroline that helped him understand the woman she had become after their separation. "She followed your career religiously," Maggie told him one evening as they watched Ava play with her cousins. "Every article, every interview, she kept a scrapbook." "I wish she had reached out," Nicholas said, the familiar pang of regret surfacing. "We lost so much time." Maggie nodded sadly. She was going to, when she first got sick, but then the treatment started, and she focused all her energy on getting well for Ava's sake. By the time she accepted, that wasn't going to happen. She trailed off, then met his gaze directly. "She would be happy, you know, seeing you with Ava, seeing the man you've become." Nicholas wasn't sure about that, couldn't quite forgive himself for the years of absence, even if they hadn't been his choice, but he was determined to make every moment count from now on. As winter gave way to spring, Nicholas found himself facing an anniversary he had never expected to commemorate. 1 year since Ava had walked into that restaurant and turned his world upside down. He planned a special day to mark the occasion, including a return visit to Le Ciel, the restaurant where they had first met. As they were seated at the same table where Nicholas had been closing the Peterson deal that fateful evening, he couldn't help but marvel at how everything had changed. "This place is fancy," Ava whispered, looking around at the elegant surroundings. Now 8 years old, she had grown taller and more confident in the past year, though her gray eyes, his eyes, still held the same perceptive wisdom that had struck him from the beginning. "Very fancy," Nicholas agreed, "but I think we can handle it." As they enjoyed their meal, the chef had prepared a special child-friendly version of the restaurant's signature dishes for Ava. Nicholas found himself reflecting on the journey they had taken together. "Do you remember that night?" he asked. "When you first found me?" Ava nodded, her expression turning serious. "I was really scared, but Mom had told me exactly what to do. She said to be brave and to show you the picture and the letter." She took a sip of her sparkling water. "I thought you might not want me." The simple admission pierced Nicholas's heart. "I was scared too," he confessed. "I didn't know how to be a father. I still don't sometimes." "You're pretty good at it now," Ava said, with the matter-of-fact honesty of childhood. "Except when you try to bake cookies. Those were really bad." Nicholas laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet restaurant. "I have other talents, like making business deals and doing really hard math in your head," Ava agreed, "and telling good bedtime stories." After dinner, Nicholas had one more surprise. He handed Ava a small, wrapped package. "What's this for?" she asked, turning it over in her hands. "It's not my birthday." "It's for our anniversary," Nicholas explained. "1 year since we found each other." Ava opened the package carefully, revealing a silver locket. Inside was a small photo of Caroline on one side and Nicholas on the other. "So, you'll always have both of us with you," Nicholas said softly. Tears welled in Ava's eyes as she traced the contours of the locket with her finger. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Can you put it on me?" Nicholas fastened the chain around her neck, his fingers clumsy with emotion. "Perfect," he said. Ava threw her arms around him in a fierce hug. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, Ava," Nicholas replied, holding her close. "More than anything in the world." Later that night, after Ava had fallen asleep, her new locket still around her neck, Nicholas sat in his home office reviewing quarterly reports from the company. Under Chen's leadership, the business was thriving. The Melbourne deal had been successfully closed. New markets were opening in Asia, and the stock price was at an all-time high. Nicholas felt a sense of satisfaction in these achievements, but it was different now, more distant, less consuming. His identity was no longer bound up in the company's success or failure. He had found something more meaningful to define his life. A small sound drew his attention. Nicholas looked up to see Ava standing in the doorway, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Bad dream?" he asked, immediately setting aside the reports. Ava nodded, crossing the room to climb onto his lap, a rare gesture that told him how upset she was. At 8, she usually insisted she was too big for such displays of affection. "Want to talk about it?" Nicholas asked, smoothing her hair. "I dreamed about Mom," Ava said quietly. "She was in the hospital again, and I was all alone." She fiddled with her locket. "Sometimes I get scared that something might happen to you too, and then I'd have nobody." Nicholas tightened his arms around her. "That's not going to happen," he promised. "But even if it did, which it won't, you would never be alone. You have Aunt Maggie and Uncle Peter and your cousins and all your friends from school." "But they're not you," Ava said simply. Nicholas understood then that what Ava feared wasn't just losing him. It was losing the special bond they had formed, the connection that had grown between them despite the years of separation. "I'm not going anywhere," he assured her again. "But do you know what your mom told me in her letter? She said you have my determination, my ability to solve problems." He touched the locket around her neck. "You have pieces of both of us inside you. No matter what happens, you'll never be truly alone because of that." Ava considered this, her small face serious in the dim light of the office. "I like having parts of both of you," she said finally, "even though I miss her a lot." "I miss her too," Nicholas admitted. "I miss the chance we never had to raise you together, but I'm so grateful that she brought you into the world and took such good care of you until you found me." Ava yawned, her eyelids growing heavy. "Can I stay here with you for a little while?" "As long as you want," Nicholas said, reaching for the book they were currently reading together. As he began to read softly, Ava's breathing gradually slowed and deepened until she was asleep again, safe in her father's arms. Nicholas closed the book, but didn't move to take her back to bed just yet. Instead, he sat quietly, holding his daughter, marveling at the twist of fate that had brought her into his life. 1 year ago, Nicholas Carter had been at the pinnacle of professional success, wealthy, powerful, respected, and utterly alone. His carefully controlled world had been exactly as he designed it, perfect, efficient, empty. And then a little girl with his eyes had called him Daddy in a 5-star restaurant, and everything had changed. The penthouse that had once been a showcase was now undeniably a home, filled with children's books and art projects, game nights and movie marathons, laughter, and occasionally tears. The man who had once valued efficiency above all else now found himself willingly spending hours building elaborate Lego structures or answering endless why questions. Nicholas Carter, CEO, had been replaced by Nicholas Carter, father, and he wouldn't change a thing. Carefully, trying not to wake her, Nicholas carried Ava back to her room. He tucked her in, making sure her stuffed rabbit was positioned just right beside her pillow. As he turned to leave, his eye caught the framed drawing on her nightstand, a child's rendering of 2 stick figures holding hands. Above them, in Ava's careful printing, "Me and Dad." Nicholas smiled, not the calculated one he had once used in boardrooms, but a real, unguarded expression of joy. He had spent his life building an empire, accumulating wealth and power and influence. But only now did he understand what true success meant. He had found his daughter, or rather, she had found him. And in doing so, she had given him the greatest gift of all, the chance to become the man he was always meant to be. Nicholas reached down to brush a strand of hair from Ava's forehead, his touch gentle as a whisper. "Good night, sweetheart," he murmured. "I'll see you in the morning." And he would. Tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that. Because Nicholas Carter had finally discovered what truly mattered in life. Not the deals or the acquisitions or the corner office with the view. What mattered was love, family. The small, ordinary moments that, strung together, created an extraordinary life. As Nicholas closed Ava's door softly behind him, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. His journey from cold, calculating businessman to devoted father wasn't complete. There would always be new challenges, new lessons to learn, but he was on the right path now. The path that had begun the moment a brave little girl had walked into his perfectly controlled world and called him Dad. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story about finding what truly matters in life, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever experienced a moment that completely changed your life's direction.